This is the Truth Network.
Hidden treasures of the Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. What an amazing way we get to end chapter 1 today in the Song of Songs in verse 17. And it's spectacular. As you might imagine, I would say at the onset of this that it was my sort of, I guess, theory that the first chapter would be the Aleph chapter, and I'll have everything to do with the letter Aleph. And very interesting that the connection between Aleph and Bet and wisdom and understanding. And I think we're going to see all that. I think it clearly points to that in so many different ways. And as we get to wisdom and understanding, you know, it was obviously a big issue for Solomon. He wrote about it in so many different ways that we will see that here in this verse and how much love has to do with it. So in verse 17, in English, it reads, "The beams of our house are cedar and our rafters of fir." So, you know, you can't help but just immediately know that Proverbs 24:3 says, through wisdom, a house is built, and by understanding, it's established. And the neat thing about the word house in Hebrew, I think it's absolutely spectacular, is that it's not just a building that, you know, you are of the house of whatever your last name is, like I'm the house of Dillmore, or, you know, and the kingdom has to do with, you know, God's house. And the house has a great deal to do more with people, in my perspective, than it does with buildings, just like the church. And, you know, the wisdom of the Aleph and how much that has to do with love is spectacular. And so, you know, I hope you see the connection that we've just gone through. Obviously 16, this is the 17 verses, but we've gone through 16 verses of these two falling in love, and love is so critical to, you know, what's going on here. So another thing that I would note immediately, as again, we know that Solomon had much to do with wisdom, and he certainly is pointing this verse to that. You know, one of the things we talked about, one of the fundamentals of the 119th Psalm clearly is Deuteronomy 4:6, and that speaks back to our quest to understand what a statute is, and perhaps to see how much that the commandment that Jesus gave us, love one another, right, is so foundational to the church itself and so foundational to love. So Deuteronomy 4:6, I would remind you, you know, it's just one of those verses that just seems to be just one of the basics. But anyway, it says, "Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom." And he's talking about statutes, by the way. "Keep therefore and do them, for this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the nations, which shall hear all these statutes and say, surely this is a great nation, is a wise and understanding people." So when you see a nation all fighting with itself and whatever else is going on, you're not sitting there going, there's a lot of wisdom and understanding here. But it gets back to the idea of what we start out with, the idea that a statute is a love song to some extent that's in our hearts. And when we see a couple that's basically just dearly, dearly, dearly in love, what are they doing? Well, they're building their house of cedar and of fir. And again, these are the very elements, you know, that Solomon ordered by the tons and tons in order to build the temple, were cedar and fir. And so the idea of, you know, the foundations or the beams being of cedar, which is the wood that was used to cleanse things, and clearly it doesn't rot because insects won't get it and all that kind of thing. It's got a spectacular number of qualities. But also don't miss that wood has everything to do with righteousness, okay? That, you know, the ark was built out of wood, and that, by the way, is the first time you see the word house in the scriptures, has to do with the ark in so many different ways, and the idea that it was, in its own way, the church. and wood is there. Wood was in the Ark of the Covenant, and again, wood would be used on the cross, that Jesus would build his church, you know, essentially through this idea of wood. And of course, every sacrifice that was ever burnt was burnt on wood. And And wood, again, is it, when you look at the word in Hebrew, you see it's righteous, and it has to do with it being vertical, and, in so many different ways. Points to God, all that stuff. And so you can see that here, this house is being built on the right stuff, okay, when it's getting built by cedars and firs. And I also would point out, just as a casual observer, that the word cedars starts with an aleph. It's actually an Alef-Resh. And so where you think it's the beginning of wisdom, right? And the word fir is Bet-Resh, okay? Do you think that's accident? I don't think so. Because again, you got wisdom and you got the understanding, and you can't help but note, or I'm sitting there going, okay, Bina in Hebrew is definitely understanding. And the wisdom of the Father has to do with the Aleph. And so, many, many, many people make the connection between Aleph being wisdom and Bet being understanding. And so, it's pretty spectacular when you see what's coming on here, is this idea of how foundational wisdom and love fit together. And I just, think back to my own family, the house of Dillmore, right? And what God did with our family near the end of my parents' lives. Unfortunately, there was a huge rift that had happened between my sisters. There were four in my, my mother's children would be the family that I'm referring to, because, both my parents had lots of stepchildren that were not part of my family. But from my perspective, they were part of my family, but I didn't grow up with them. I grew up with the four of us. There were two sisters, and I have one little brother, which I dearly love, all of them. And but unfortunately, there became this huge rift between my sisters and my father, and oh my gosh, they weren't talking to each other, and it got really, really, really ugly. And my father, after the death of my stepmother, came to live in our area, and we kind of took care of him the last couple years of his life. One of the joys of all that. But in that time, we prayed a lot and talked a lot. And my father had actually written my sisters out of his will and all that. And it was really cool to see how God, and I'm going to give God all the credit here, God touched my father's heart to reconnect his house, so that at his death, it was beautiful that, both my sisters were there. Of course, my brother and he and I had always gotten along well. It's just a neat thing to see that reconciliation. And if that doesn't look like wisdom and understanding, that your house would be put back together, man, nobody wants to be remembered as a house divided, right? I mean, it's just a spectacular thing to think that as we love, and you've heard it said many times about, the best thing you can give your children is to love their mother, or if you're the wife, to love their father. That there's nothing like this foundation of love and understanding. I mean, it just is. And so kind of fun as we finish up this Aleph, what I think is the Aleph section, and we'll go on to the next chapter, which will be the Bet, and see more about how this understanding is played out. As now you might guess that my supposition or my theory is that the second chapter will be about the Bet. And again, going to 8 chapters, being the 8th chapter will be the Het, the miracle chapter. And I'm really excited about this journey. And thank you so much for joining me in it. It encouraged me so much. God bless.